Good morning to the DME for Peace community. Welcome to this week's edition of the M&E Thursday Talks. These Thursday Talk webinars on DME for Peace are made possible with the support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York through the Peace Building Evaluation Consortium. Just in case you've forgotten, my name is Jack Farrell and I am the DME for Peace Project Manager at Search for Common Ground, based here in the beautiful and unseasonably warm Washington, D.C. Today, I am delighted to welcome Lauren Kelly, who is the Senior Evaluation Officer in the Independent Evaluation Group of the World Bank, to lead a discussion on third-party monitoring and evaluation in conflict-affected areas. As a reminder, once Lauren is finished speaking, we'll jump right into a question and answer session. You can ask your questions throughout the webinar by submitting them through the question function on GoToWebinar. I'm now not going to take up any more of your time and hand this over to Lauren to get us underway. Lauren, you're very welcome to the Thursday Talks, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Jack. Jack, do we know how many people have joined at this point?
We've around about 70 people online now.
Great, wonderful. Well, welcome everyone. I'm really taken back by the showing, the number of attendees. So this is really wonderful. Thank you for joining. Like Jack said, my name's Lauren Kelly. I work for the Independent Evaluation Group of the World Bank. I'm not going to take much time talking about myself, but really just dive right into the issues. That's why you're all here. I started working on this issue on third-party monitoring about a year ago, and I started working on it when I came back from a few field missions, particularly in Africa. When it occurred to me that really there's a lot of stuff going on out there in World Bank projects with regard to this idea of third-party monitoring, but there wasn't a dialogue or a platform for sharing knowledge or even for discussing some of the more thorny issues, like the quality of our data that we were collecting or the ethics around this process. So in order to stimulate that dialogue from IEG, and as you know, it's difficult from where we sit a bit because we are an independent part of the bank, but in order to stimulate that dialogue, we wrote a blog, and it was quite effective. And the blog, I think that Jack has shared it, was really meant just to sort of, it's tip of the iceberg, but it was really meant to start a dialogue. As part of that process, the bank has been working for about, I don't know, a few months now on really sort of working all across its different parts to sort of gather knowledge from all the different teams that are working on third-party monitoring. And sort of put together a toolkit. So I just wanted to use this opportunity, and again, thanks for joining, to talk about some of the concepts that are evolving in the World Bank Group, and then also to use a lot of our time to listen to you, to understand, your own understanding of the concepts that lie behind third-party monitoring, how you're implementing it, and how you are dealing with some of the challenges and the risks that we're dealing with as well. So I'll start by saying that the reason why this has become such a big issue, a big topic in the bank, is because our funding for low-income countries, the IDA funds, have increased also with the corporate mandate to increase that funding into our fragile and conflict states. And by doing that, what we mean is that what we're going to have is not just increased funding, but larger projects, and larger projects not just in states, but also that touch into areas that are affected directly by ongoing conflicts. And so this raises a conundrum for the bank because, in fact, we have a philosophy, and that philosophy is that we're not willing to lose a single life. Now, that philosophy is quite different than a lot of the agencies that you work for, where you take more risks and that you're more willing to sort of directly confront those challenges and those risks. So the question then, what does that mean if we're increasing our funding and investments in conflict-affected areas, but we're not willing to lose a life? And that's where I think the third-party monitoring conversation comes in. So I want to be, let's see if we have, can everyone still hear, Jack, can everyone still hear me? I'm just making sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So that's where, that's where we'll begin the discussion today, really about what do we mean by third-party monitoring. And what's quite interesting about what we mean by it is that our definition, and the definition in evolving, really needs to be thought through, because in effect it really does differ from what I'm finding exists in other agencies, in the UN, within the NGO community. And I'll just read this, and then I'll just speak to it briefly. The definition we've been using is that the third-party monitoring is monitoring by parties that are external to the project or the program's direct beneficiary chain or its management chain. Okay. It has a focus on results. It says that it's intended to also assess whether intended outputs, outcomes, and impacts have been achieved by the project. But the thing that the definition doesn't do, it does not delegate responsibility for overall implementation support to third-party agents. So what's interesting about our definition is that what it's saying is that, first of all, we have to be very cautious about the fact that third-party monitoring exists in these projects to verify risks, to also verify that the provisions in our legal agreement are being complied with, so it's a compliance mechanism. What that means is that all the fiduciary management and procurement, payroll, all of the stuff that needs to be checked, usually by a World Bank Group support team, is done, and that's done through a third-party monitoring system. But what it doesn't do, and I think this is the issue that we're raising, is really get to the question of the overall implementation support and what's needed in conflict-affected areas. So what we're saying is that, if TPM is third-party monitoring is a question of agency, it doesn't need to be a question of methods. Okay, it doesn't need to drive the data narrative, or it doesn't need to drive the sort of the data collection or method choice narrative. But I think what we're noticing in effect is that it may be. So, all right, and why is that? Most of our work, and I'll give you an example, most of the work that's going on in third-party monitoring is in some of our toughest countries. It's been applied so far in Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, Cameroon, Iraq, and South Sudan. And we've spent about $50 million on third-party monitoring so far through contracts, vendor contracts. There's a general consensus at this point that we need to take a step back because costs are too high. And it's not the overall cost, it's the average cost. So we're spending about $2 million per contract. And what we're getting out of those contracts, frankly, is good verification both of the fiduciary responsibilities that are aligned with the legal agreements in our project. And we're also getting some good asset verification, so information on the construction of assets and even their locations, through a combination of human third-party monitoring and ICT. But it raises a few questions. In terms of the costs, we are spending about 10 times as much on these programs just to verify those legal provisions and the construction of assets as we are in a usual project. Okay, and that really stands out. And the second thing is that, therefore, then we're also only able to utilize our trust funds. We're only able to use trust funds because it's a conflict of interest to use our bank budget within a project that is being implemented by our client or the host country, because we need that external verification of those provisions in the legal agreement. So one, if the costs are so high, and two, that the funding source is external to the bank, and therefore, somewhat unreliable or unpredictable, then where do we go from here? And that's kind of the conversation we're having on scaling up now. How do we take a model that was, in effect, kind of really built for Afghanistan, and how do we take that into a lot of our low-income countries that are conflict-affected to get the sort of verification we need? But then how do we also move that more into the realm of better quality data collection, and also how do we talk about it from the point of view of the quality of that data and also the ethics? And that moves us into the next part of the conversation, and this is really what the blog was trying to pick up on. So the kind of questions that are being raised now as we move into sort of a scaling up of this approach is around some questions around who are the third-party monitors, and what kind of policy or standards are we applying, and what kind of ethics come into play here. What's happened so far is that really we've relied on our vendors through our terms of reference to assure that to assure security and to include provisions that relate to the risks that are being taken by subcontractors. And what happens with that is, in effect, it raises a question for the bank, because when you get down the
Hi, Lauren. It appears your microphone has stopped working.
Okay, where did I leave off, Jack?
About 10 seconds ago. So if you just want to go back to sort of you just began sort of outlining sort of the new points on the blog.
Thank you. So on the ethics issue, I think we were at.
Yes, perfect.
Great. Yeah, I'll just rewind that. And sorry about that. Yeah. So on the ethics issue, I think that indeed it raises a few questions, and it's not just ethics. It's really the terms of reference. It's really how we're contracting. And so far, what I've noticed or what we've recorded is that those issues around risks and provisions for security we're relying on the vendors and the terms of reference and the contracts that we have with vendors, and on their own obligations towards the subcontractors vis-a-vis the vendors. So the bottom line is that there's a disassociation with the bank, and I would suggest that there's a disassociation with
And again, we just lost you there, Lauren, on the points you're making around disassociation. Okay, well, while we sort of wait for Lauren to sort of reappear online, for the DME for Peace community, if you're looking to learn more about what the bank are doing in these third-party contexts, you can see Lauren's blog on DME for Peace, and it is in your chat box right now. Lauren, are you back?
I'm back. Yeah, I don't. My mute keeps coming on, but I'll notice it from now on. Thanks, Jack.
No problem. It's just you're on. You got to the point on dissociation.
Yeah. So then I think we got to the conflict of interest. I don't know if I'll just pick up there then. The conflict of interest is a third risk, and I think the risk that we're talking about here is if we're not aware of who we're pulling from the communities or how they are themselves sort of part of the local political economy, how are we also thinking through the conflict of interest that's occurring as part of the third-party monitoring? So those are just 3 or 4 of some of I think both the ethics that we'd like to continue to discuss, I think as IEG, as part of the discussion in the World Bank, but also that I'd like to talk about as part of the Q&A. The second thing I like to pull through this Q&A is an issue of skills. I mean, as we scale up, I think the idea really is that what we're finding is that a lot of folks that are being contracted have strong technical skills, and particularly increasingly, ICT smart skills, all right, and a general awareness of the tasks, but weak qualitative assessment skills. And then the question becomes, what are we seeking through this model, and how can one model fit all? And I'd like to hear back from that. The last issue that is being raised and that we're discussing sort of as part of this dialogue is the response rate. So in our model, when the World Bank is contracting a project through a government client, and even then when another agency, let's say the UN or an international NGO, is running that project, it then subcontracts some of that monitoring or evaluation to a third party, to a vendor, and then the vendor then contracts locally. Okay. The question is, how can we ensure a good response rate? And so far what we're finding is that when the problems or challenges are being identified by a third party that are often 4 links down the chain to the program management, per a typical telephone game, I think, challenge, first of all, the problems are hard to communicate up accurately. But second of all, it's hard to get the attention of decision makers and program managers. And therefore, how long does it take, and how do we then create a system where when challenges are being cited, and the third-party monitors obviously are in a good place to do that, how do they get responded to? And what we're finding is that indeed, it's either taking a long time or those challenges are not being responded to. The last thing I would say, and this comes from a great conversation we've been having with CDA, is I would say also that the issue of conflict sensitivity is really not part of the discourse to date. And the reason why it's not part of the discourse so far is that there's a sort of an overwhelmed effect. This idea of getting at least the contracting, the terms of reference, the knowledge sharing, the reporting of data, all the stuff I've been talking about, even the ethics, sort of squared away as we think about how we're scaling this process. What's been left behind, or maybe not left behind, but what's sort of on the sideline is this great issue of conflict sensitivity, and we've raised it also in the bank. And what I mean by that is if our field agents or folks in the field, if we're finding that they're better technically able to collect data, let's say on assets or the construction of those assets or the location, but we're also finding that some of the qualitative skills are weak, then what do we also mean by training or thinking through how we'd also think about conflict sensitivity and getting the kind of human intelligence we need, or the eyes on the ground, to feed up that information on things that might be also creating risk. So in our blog, what we talked about also is that, in the past we've used third-party monitoring outside of conflict-affected areas to do third-party monitoring on risky sectors like mining and forests. And we use that as a social accountability tool. So we have a lot of experience in thinking not about conflict sensitivity, but about social accountability from the point of view, for example, chain of custody in the extractives or resource sectors. So this is not unfamiliar territory. But what's unfamiliar, I think, a bit is to say, what does it mean to have conflict sensitivity built into your third-party monitoring framework? Now, one suggestion that's been made, of course, is that, and it's strange in the bank because our monitoring and evaluation systems, our results frameworks, are separate from what I'm talking about, and we can also talk about that during Q&A. But the conflict sensitivity could be built into different parts of the project. But if we're talking about third-party monitoring and how they would achieve more eyes on the ground, what would it take to create a better skill set? And what kind of tools would we need to translate those messages upwards and to have a real-time response when we're sensing that there's conflict sensitivity? I think outside of the third-party monitoring, the bank lately has been...
And again, Lauren, I think you muted yourself.
I'm here. Got it?
Perfect, yeah. I think you accidentally muted yourself.
Yep. It's that the phone's going on and off from mute. I'm not sure why. It's just sort of, I guess I'll figure out why the phone is doing this later. But just to say that, and I'll end by saying this, that in terms of conflict sensitivity, we've had some experiences lately with our inspection panel on pretty standard projects, but in tough environments. Two of the processes we've been going through lately in the bank are on roads and subcontracting, in the road sector.
Again, Lauren, we seem to have lost you. Not sure if it's an issue with your phone or Wi-Fi. But I'm going to use this period because I know Lauren was finishing up to make a point about the questions and answers. As some of you know, the DME for Peace Thursday talks are recorded and posted online. So we're trying to make sure that the wider community benefits from your discussion and engagement on these webinars. You can ask a question one of two ways. The first way you can ask a question is through the question function on GoToWebinar. The second way you can ask a question is by raising your hand on the GoToWebinar dashboard. That will allow us to unmute your microphone so you can ask your question live. When you do ask a question, we ask you to submit your name and affiliation. So just so we have a bit of context about sort of the perspective you're asking the question from. Lauren, I believe I hear you in the background now.
I'm here. Is that okay? Or?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, sorry. We just dropped you out whenever you're talking about the sort of programs on sort of two of the bank's most recent programs regarding roads.
Yeah. Yeah, and I want to go to Q&A. I love that we're moving into Q&A now. The idea really is that conflict sensitivity need not be an issue we only talk about when we talk about third-party monitoring, of course. Conflict sensitivity in a very sort of small c sense, right? Where we have risks that are not being attended to with regard to some of just our mainstream projects like building roads in risky areas. So I just wanted to widen the discussion because third-party monitoring is a modality. But when we talk about conflict sensitivity, of course, there's there's a need and opportunity to think about that more widely.
Great. Well, thank you very much,
Yeah.
Lauren. Thank you for persevering through
lot.
any technological challenges, and thank you to the audience for being so patient. We actually have over 100 people online right now, so I'm looking forward to this Q&A. As a reminder, you can submit a question one of two ways: through the question function or by raising your hand to ask your question live. So let's jump right in. The first question comes from Indy Richard Tanto, who has asked, what do you think the difference is? How do you differentiate between conflict sensitivity and social accountability?
Sure. I'm going to speak from an institutional perspective. What's really interesting about your question is that the World Bank's social development teams had developed a definition of third-party monitoring a decade ago. And third-party monitoring was seen as something that could be done by communities and something that could be done to provide an independent verification of results, but also to have upward and downwards accountability vis-a-vis the program management, vis-a-vis the client, and vis-a-vis the bank. And what's interesting about what's going on right now in the fragility and conflict settings is that these two conversations I find have been somewhat delinked. The use of third-party monitoring for greater social accountability, and in the ways I talked about that we've done that in the past, and now thinking about third-party monitoring, like as a risk management platform. And then from the point of view of conflict sensitivity, I think conflict sensitivity, in terms of the way that we're thinking about it, goes one step further. I think you said social accountability, right, Jack?
Yes, social accountability.
The question was about social accountability versus conflict sensitivity?
Yes, that is correct.
Hello?
Yes, that is correct, Lauren.
Okay. I'm sorry, I've just been unmuted. Is the question about social accountability versus conflict sensitivity?
Yes, how do you differentiate between those two terms?
Yeah, and so what's interesting about that is conflict sensitivity.
Okay, Lauren, I think we're having another issue with your microphone. I can see you're trying to speak, but you're not actually speaking. And now the microphone's disappeared. Oh, now
I'm here.
You're back. Okay, yeah. Perfect. You're back.
I'll just keep toggling it. I can see when it goes off, Jack.
Okay.
But thinking about really, if we can catch in real time, and I don't even mean during, I mean ex ante, risks that are occurring that may lead to project-created or project-triggered conflicts. So that's something that's going on in the project, some way of implementing the project, of asking questions, of even doing our M&E. Okay, some way that project is actually then triggering tension within or between the communities in which we're working. So Great. Very much related, but I think that's the way we're talking about them differently.
Great, thank you, Lauren. The next question comes from Christine McCauley, who said, thank you very much for the discussion. This is helpful, especially around considerations for third-party monitoring. But I was wondering if you could just discuss a little more about how you go about implementing third-party monitoring. What exactly is the role of the independent evaluation group versus your field office? And how do you determine which questions to ask and what tools are being used in the third-party monitoring process?
That's a great question. What we're doing right now is we're stock taking all the different ways that third-party monitoring is being used in the bank. We do not have a lot of examples in the bank of third-party monitoring yet. I think we have about a dozen projects that have used it, okay? And that's because there's a very specific definition of third-party monitoring where you are delegating the legal provisions of our financing agreement about procurement or fiduciary management to a third-party agent. In Afghanistan, for example, that's been MSI, okay? And that's probably the vendor that we've used most for third-party monitoring. But what we're doing now is we're collecting the schemas, and what's fascinating is it's being used in all different ways. The simplest way that we do it is that the World Bank, the World Bank contracts with the client, the government, which has an implementing agency ensconced in the government, okay, that implements the project. But at the same time, then the World Bank directly contracts a third-party monitoring agent, a vendor, okay? And that vendor then subcontracts the local agents that collect data or do the risk monitoring, reports back to the vendor, and that vendor reports back to, let's say, the bank or to the project. So the vendor would report, let's say, back to the project team at the World Bank. And one of the problems that we're having, I think, with that model is that, again, the reporting chain, are we going around the client? Are things not being sort of learned by the government, by their implementing agencies? And so how does that learning occur also? However, I will say, and I'm not prepared to talk about all the different models, but we have as many models for contracting and subcontracting through these projects in Yemen, Somalia, and South Sudan as there are projects. And I think one of the things that we're trying to understand now is how do we understand what is the best contracting model, both from the point of view of the data collection, but also the capacity of the client.
Great, thank you very much, Lauren. The next question comes, actually, we're going to try and unmute some microphones here so we can get some live feedback from the audience. Bengono Pierre Celestin of the UNDP, your hand is raised, so I'm going to unmute your microphone, Bengono, and feel free to ask your question.
Hi, very interesting. I want first to congratulate Lauren Kelly. Nice. But my question is related to the reporting channel and then the relation between third-party monitoring and evaluation. Because if the third-party monitoring is doing now a quality review before approving the report. Thank you.
Okay, Jack, I think I heard that, but could you summarize the question because it was going in and out?
Bengono, I wonder if you could repeat that just one more time. I think you went in and out a little.
Okay, thank you. I want to know who is the party doing the quality review after the third being implemented during the M&E. It's about the quality review.
Yeah, I mean, this is our question too. The previous question that you raised, Jack, was what is the role of IEG as well? I'll say that to date, IEG does not get involved in third-party monitoring because we mainly do ex-post evaluation. So we would be doing the review of the quality of the data as it was collected after the fact, okay, which is not very useful, which is why I think we wrote the blog. But let me talk about then the question that comes from UNDP. It depends on the model, but in effect, in a third-party monitoring model, the subcontractors will be providing the data. The local agents will be providing the data to the vendor. The vendor will be reviewing the quality of that data, okay, through all different means. That data will be given to the World Bank, and ideally, the World Bank, okay, through its supervision, would be checking the quality of that. But in a fragile and complex setting, that could be that part of the process could be being done in Washington or the Capitol, most likely in Washington in some cases. So I hear you, and the question really does, the question of quality review is raised. The issue so far, though, is that what kind of data are we talking about? And the questions we're raising are about the fact that third-party monitoring so far has been very good at providing some asset verification data. So the construction of our works, roads, wells, schools, etc., pictures, GPS points, that kind of stuff. And we can, at this point, we have enough, I think, quality control to make sure that those aren't tampered with. So that's being done. However, what I think we're raising is that we need more information on the ground about the development outcomes, about the quality of those outcomes, and about how those interventions are really leading to development impacts. And our point is that while third-party monitoring can be used to access inaccessible areas and to make sure that our legal requirements are being met on fiduciary procurement and even the quality of infrastructure, okay? Still, I think we're talking about needing better and more sophisticated and granular ways to collect good qualitative data on how all these interventions are adding up to getting to impacts. So that, I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I think that's where we are now with that.
Yeah, I think that's pretty spot on. Lauren, the next question comes from Sasha, and apologies for mispronouncing your last name, Kishinechad, who is the recently returned from Turkey as a director of monitoring and evaluation, RE building capacity of local councils in Syria under the US State Department. And Sasha's question is, the definition provided at the beginning of this session and subsequent discussion seems to focus more on the fiduciary aspect of third-party monitoring, closer to auditing than results-based assessment and impact analysis. Is the latter a component of how third-party monitoring is being used by the bank and included in IEG's model?
First of all, she's spot on, Sasha, you're spot on. I mean, that's what we noticed too, that third-party monitoring at this point, and again, we're only talking about a dozen projects, but we're also talking about $50 million, and we're also talking about billions of dollars of lending. But indeed, we've developed the definition with our legal teams so that we can be sure that these projects are compliant with the legal provisions of the financing agreements, okay, so that we make sure that those legal agreements are complied with. What's really interesting about third-party monitoring, the way we're talking about in the World Bank, is that there's a need to think about two other things. And these, I believe, are going to become a more comprehensive conversation over time, but it's on monitoring and evaluation overall during the whole life cycle of the project, okay, and how we access and get information in inaccessible areas on development outcomes and impacts, including through impact evaluations, and also on environmental and social risks. I said earlier that, for example, that a lot of these local agents are really good technically, but lack some of the qualitative skills. Well, that would mean also that collecting data in inaccessible areas on environmental risks, on social risks, including conflict sensitivity, those skills need to be built or thought through better. Because a lot of the work we've been doing now, but not just the bank, but on building local field capacity, has been on the ICT side, on the quality of data side. We now have a lot of, voice recognition checks, a lot of like mechanical Turk mechanisms to check the data quality of what's coming in. But a lot of the quality work we've been doing is on the technical side and not on the qualitative side. So completely agree, those two areas need to be built a lot more. Thanks, Sasha, for asking that. And it's incredible where you've been working, and stay safe.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Sasha, for your question. The next question comes from Laura Gagliardone, who essentially feeds off some of the points you made during the presentation and your last answer. And Laura asks, can you expand on the role, the importance or role of ICTs for effective third-party monitoring? And do you have an example of what is considered good practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me talk about that quickly, because I think there'll be a lot of ICT questions. But it's interesting that we're thinking about ICT in isolation. What happens is that I think we're thinking about it like, well, if you have a high-risk area and you're going to have high impact, so you want to do the project, then maybe what we need to do is just think about ways to use ICT. I think one of the arguments has been that ICT should be an integrated solution alongside some of the other skills that I mentioned. But a lot of it has been sort of thinking like, what can we achieve through geo-enabling our projects, through satellite monitoring, through satellite imagery. And in some of those cases, for example, in Afghanistan, where we've used satellite imagery, even drones, let's say, and I don't want to get too much into that, but to sort of think about how can we capture enough pixels of data to look at like road quality, okay? And I think that's really interesting, where we can then patch together with a really good team of engineers, a road, look at the road remotely, and really look to make sure that that road was built to the quality specifications that we indicated, and you don't have one person putting their life in harm's way. I think that's a great example. However, again, I think then therefore what we're talking about is a part of the data that needs to be collected, let's say on road quality, where you can get good satellite or or drone imagery depending on the location. But what's happening around the road? How do you learn about market activity or access to markets? How do you learn about whether it's accessible? It's one point in time. So, you know, I think that what needs to happen, and what I think is happening more and more, is that we're thinking about how do you do integrated ICT interventions, rather than thinking about it like, okay, it's either human third-party monitoring or it's ICT, depending on the risk. And then there's a lot more examples, but I'll stop there so we can get more questions or follow-up questions on that topic.
Great, thank you, Lauren. I've just learned from a number of colleagues that apparently there are Wi-Fi issues around Washington, D.C. this morning, which might explain some of the technical challenges we had in this webinar. But as always is the case, everybody is now asking questions as we get into the last 10 minutes. And something that's been asked by a number of attendees today, Lauren, is to what extent is third-party monitoring reliable in terms of data integrity? Besides using third-party monitoring for like verification, do you have any experiences of how third-party monitoring has been used for sort of outcome and results monitoring in hostile environments?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say the following. I would say that one of the reasons why we wrote the blog was to say that impact evaluation can be done, okay, in hostile environments. And we would make the case that i.e., okay, using both human and ICT enabled and other means is probably necessary to really understand impacts. And it's hard to understand how you get to understanding longer term outcomes and impacts without having more sophisticated methods being conducted. You know, I think one of the best, IEs that I've ever looked at was Andrew Beath's work in Afghanistan on the National Solidarity Program. And it's one of the best pieces of work because, you know, even though he collected data in both hostile and non-hostile environments, you know, that work really used multiple methods to understand issues like women's participation in governance and issues that really are more the ultimate sort of goals of our, you know, of that intervention, that 20-year intervention, change over time within the sort of within the local councils, rather than just thinking about it like, you know, were the assets built, were the roads built, were the wells built. And it's hard to just think about how you can get to impact without applying more sophisticated tools. I'd also say that RIEs that we've looked at, and there's been 19 of them that we've reviewed, in, I think, let's see, 14 different countries and some cross-national studies. In addition to outcomes and impacts, which they've been able to reveal, okay, they also better are able to think through and point to evidence on conflict dampening or conflict sort of triggering. And without, I think, those sensitive tools built into M&E, we don't get that kind of data. And on my blog, you'll see a reference to some of the findings from those IEs, and you can click on them and read them, and they're really fascinating.
Lauren, I'm going to take this sort of moment to sort of use my moderator's privilege to ask a question sort of that I've been thinking about with regards to third-party evaluation, and that is that it's obvious it fills an important gap, but I guess building on sort of the ethical issues, what are the sort of, how is a third party treated compared to internal staff? Like often humanitarian organizations don't provide the same benefits provided to international staff to local staff, such as medical evacuation or protection. I was just wondering about your experience with vendors, like how have these third party evaluators sort of been treated essentially?
I can say that, you know, one of the reasons why we're working on this is because of the nomenclature, the terminology around third-party monitoring and trying to understand what it means. So I can tell you that obviously there's no lives lost in the bank. That's the mantra. And I think the bank goes out of its way to make sure that happens. I can also tell you that when I hire locally, if I have one single person, and like I just came back from Mali, that's a Malian that's on a World Bank contract, they're treated the same way. They're not allowed to go into the areas that are off limits to me. So all the rules apply. What's interesting is when they're not on that contract, okay? I think that's a great question and one that remains a bit unanswered. we'd have to go into data on the way that the vendors have dealt with lives lost and look more into the sort of the compensation packages for them or their families. We'd have to look at sort of the real security provisions that are being made. I do know that, for example, in my work in Mali, for example, that in some of the projects, and these weren't termed third-party monitoring, which is why I find it fascinating, that when we were working with international NGOs that were subcontracting, one of the biggest frustrations with the bank is that when we delay our work, it becomes very expensive for our international partners, the international NGOs, to provide the security that they need to provide because of the disbursement schedule. Because when there's delays, our partners, and particularly international NGOs, have to sort of come up with the funding to bridge the gap. And that funding is so critically necessary because those subcontractors, the agents in the field, have to stay there. And they're out there, and without the money flowing, they don't have the protection they need.
Thank you, Lauren. I think we have time for one last question, and this comes from Carlo Carugi, who asks, is third-party monitoring being used to gather monitoring and evaluation data on environmental outcomes, or is it being applied to development interventions?
I know Carlo. Hi, Carlo. Okay, so so far, third-party monitoring is not being thought of as a comprehensive monitoring and evaluation tool. And the reason why I think the bank is working on this now internally is to say that we need smart implementation support in fragile and conflict-affected areas, and that needs to be a comprehensive approach that goes beyond third-party monitoring, which is more of a fiduciary and you know, an illegal risk management system. In environment, I haven't seen any examples. I've got about a dozen projects examples in the countries I've mentioned. I haven't seen any environment projects being covered by third-party monitoring yet. I would suspect that it could occur, though, as we ramp up our IDA, and particularly in FCV, and those are applied to environment operations.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Lauren, and thank you for your great presentation and bearing with us through any technological challenge. And thank you to the DME for Peace community for joining this edition of the Thursday Talks. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded, and we're going to post it on our media gallery later today. So please feel free to return to it, continue the discussion, and share it with your colleagues. We're going to be back next week, that is February 22nd, with Jessica Baumgardner-Zuzik of Alliance for Peacebuilding, who will be leading the discussion on 7 guiding steps to achieving better learning in peacebuilding evaluation as part of the work of the Peacebuilding Evaluation Consortium, which DME for Peace is a part of. And we're developing these guiding steps to sort of guide peacebuilding evaluation. So we're looking forward to that discussion and more of a consultation with the wider community. And right now in your chat box, you can find a link to register for that webinar. Thank you again to the 100+ people that joined. Your support is always appreciated. And thank you once more to Lauren for being a wonderful host. And I will see you online in the near future.
Thank you, Jack.